At 46, Lydia Hartwell never expected to find herself widowed and pregnant, standing in the doorway of her half-finished ranch house with winter approaching fast. When she posted an advertisement in the Fort Harmony Gazette for a reliable housekeeper, she certainly didn't expect the stagecoach to deliver Cole Mercer, a weathered cowboy with calloused hands and two wide-eyed 9-year-old twins trailing behind him. Cole had lost everything to a flash flood that wiped out his cattle lease. All he had left was his pride, his children, and a desperate need for shelter before the Montana snows arrived. What he offered Lydia was simple. He'd cook, clean, and finish the roof her late husband had started, in exchange for a place to stay and schooling for Ruth and Rory. But when her labor begins early during a fierce winter storm, will this makeshift family prove strong enough to weather the crisis ahead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September morning sun cast long shadows across the valley floor as Lydia Hartwell pressed her palm against the small of her back and surveyed the work that stretched endlessly before her. The ranch house Samuel had dreamed of building stood half-complete, its skeleton of timber beams reaching toward the Montana sky like the ribs of some great beast. Above, where a proper roof should have sheltered them from the coming winter, only bare rafters caught the morning light. Samuel had been gone 3 months now, taken by a heart attack so sudden that the coffee cup was still warm in his hands when she found him slumped over his account books in the kitchen. 3 months, and the grief still hit her at unexpected moments when she caught herself setting 2 plates instead of 1, or when she woke reaching for his familiar warmth in their bed. But grief, she had learned, was a luxury she could not afford, not with winter approaching and a child growing beneath her heart. The baby moved restlessly as she stood there, a flutter of tiny limbs that made her breath catch with wonder even now, 4 months into carrying him. Yes, him, she was certain of it, though Doc Morrison had clucked his tongue and told her there was no way to know for sure. But mothers knew things, didn't they? This child felt different from the beginning, precious in a way that made her protective instincts flare like wildfire. Samuel never knew. The cruel irony of it still took her breath away on the loneliest nights. They had tried for 15 years to have a child, enduring the pitying looks of neighbors and the well-meaning advice of church ladies who seemed to think prayer and patience were the only remedies for an empty womb. Then, just weeks before Samuel's death, she had begun to suspect. She had planned to tell him over his favorite dinner of pot roast and sweet potatoes, had even practiced the words while she worked in the garden. Now she carried their miracle alone. The doctor's words echoed in her memory. "Mrs. Hartwell, at your age, this pregnancy requires careful attention. You must avoid heavy lifting, excessive activity, and stress. Complete bed rest for the final month would be ideal." Complete bed resters if she had that luxury with a half-built house, winter approaching, and no one but herself to rely on. That was when she had conceived the plan to place an advertisement in the Fort Harmony Gazette, a practical solution to a practical problem. She needed help with the household duties, someone reliable and experienced who could assist with the cooking, cleaning, and light maintenance until the baby came. Someone middle-aged and sensible, perhaps a widow like herself, who understood the weight of responsibility and the value of honest work. The advertisement had been simple and direct. Respectable widow seeks reliable housekeeper. Room, board, and fair wages. References required. Apply in person. L. Hartwell, Harmony Valley Ranch. She had envisioned someone like Mrs. Patterson from Town, sturdy, no nonsense, with graying hair pinned back and hands that knew their way around a kitchen. Someone who would cluck approvingly at her condition, take charge of the household with quiet efficiency, and perhaps even offer the kind of maternal advice Lydia had never received from her own mother, who had died when Lydia was barely 16. The valley around the ranch stretched for miles in every direction, a tapestry of golden grass and scattered stands of aspen that would soon flame into autumn colors. Samuel had chosen this spot for its beauty, as much as its practicality, sheltered from the worst winds by a line of low hills to the north, with good water from the creek that ran year-round, and enough flat ground for the cattle operation he had planned to expand. They had lived in the old cabin for the first 10 years of their marriage, a snug 2-room structure that Samuel's father had built when he first claimed this land. But Samuel had bigger dreams. He wanted to build something lasting, something that would stand for generations and shelter the family they hoped to have. The new house was to be spacious and solid, with a wide front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint the mountains purple. Now, walking through the rooms that existed only as frames and foundations, Lydia could see Samuel's vision as clearly as if he stood beside her. The front parlor would have windows facing west to catch the afternoon light. The kitchen would be large enough for a proper dining table where a family could gather for meals. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms waited to be finished for them, one for guests and one that they had never spoken of aloud, but both had imagined, filled with the laughter of children. The irony was not lost on her that the child's room might be the first to be completed, born of necessity rather than hope. She moved carefully through the house, one hand trailing along the smooth wood Samuel had shaped with his own hands. He had been a meticulous craftsman, taking pride in every joint and angle. The work that remained was beyond her capabilities, the heavy lifting, the precise measurements, the knowledge of how to make walls square and roofs watertight. She had watched Samuel work often enough to understand the process, but watching and doing were entirely different things. The kitchen, at least, was functional. Samuel had completed it first, knowing that a working kitchen was essential to any household. The cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its presence both comforting and daunting. Feeding its hungry firebox would be a constant chore through the long winter months, but it would provide both heat and cooking capability when the snows came. Adjacent to the kitchen, the pantry shelves stood ready to hold the preserved foods that would see them through until spring. Lydia had spent much of the summer canning vegetables from her garden, putting up jar after jar of green beans, tomatoes, and pickled beets. Samuel had always praised her skill at preserving food, joking that she could make a feast from nothing but weeds and determination. The garden itself was another source of both pride and worry. The vegetables were ready for the final harvest: pumpkins and winter squash that would store well, carrots and potatoes that could be kept in the root cellar Samuel had dug behind the house. But the work of harvesting, processing, and storing everything properly was daunting for a woman in her condition. As she stood in the kitchen doorway, watching dust motes dance in the slanted morning light, Lydia allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. The silence was absolute, except for the distant sound of wind in the grass and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. This was the kind of silence that could drive a person to despair if they let it, the kind that made you aware of every heartbeat and every breath. But she had learned to find companionship in solitude. She talked to Samuel sometimes, carrying on conversations with him as she worked. She talked to the baby too, describing the world he would soon enter and the father he would never know. These one-sided conversations had become a comfort, a way of maintaining connection in the face of overwhelming isolation. The sound of wheels on the dirt road that led to the ranch made her heart leap with unexpected hope. It was too early for the weekly mail delivery, and she received few visitors these days. Could it be someone responding to her advertisement already? The paper had only come out yesterday, but news traveled fast in small communities, and perhaps word had spread. She smoothed her skirts and checked her appearance in the small mirror Samuel had hung beside the kitchen door. Her reflection showed a woman who looked older than her 46 years, with premature silver threading through her dark hair and worry lines etched around her green eyes. But there was still strength in her face, still determination in the set of her jaw. The pregnancy had softened some of the sharp angles that grief had carved into her features over the past months. Her cheeks had filled out slightly, and there was a glow about her that people said came with carrying a child. She had always been tall for a woman, but now her expanded waistline made her feel ungainly and awkward. Still, she carried herself with dignity, as her mother had taught her to do all those years ago. The wagon, for she could see now that it was a wagon rather than the lighter buggy she might have expected, was making its way slowly up the winding track that led to the house. She could make out a single figure on the driver's seat, though the distance and angle made it impossible to determine anything more specific. Lydia stepped out onto the front porch, grateful that Samuel had at least completed this part of the house before his death. The wide boards beneath her feet were solid and level, and the roof overhang would provide shelter from rain and snow. Two sturdy chairs sat side by side, where she and Samuel had spent countless evenings watching the sunset and planning their future. As the wagon drew closer, she began to make out more details. The driver was clearly a man, which struck her as odd, since she had expected her advertisement to attract female applicants. He wore a weather-beaten hat pulled low over his face, and his clothes had the dusty, practical look of someone who worked outdoors for a living. Behind him in the wagon bed, she caught glimpses of household goods furniture covered with canvas tarps, boxes and bundles that suggested a family moving from one place to another. And there, on either side of the man on the driver's seat, two small figures that could only be children. Lydia felt a flutter of uncertainty in her chest. This was not at all what she had expected or planned for. A man with children was an entirely different proposition from the capable middle-aged woman she had envisioned. It would raise questions about propriety and reputation that she was not prepared to face. But as the wagon pulled up in front of the house, and she got her first clear look at its occupants, something in their appearance stopped her from immediately turning them away. The man was older than she had first thought, somewhere in his 50s, with silver showing in the dark hair that curled beneath his hat brim. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but it was an honest face, with kind eyes and a mouth that looked as though it smiled more often than it frowned. The children Wins, she realized with surprise, were perhaps 9 or 10 years old, with matching freckled faces and curious eyes that took in everything around them with alert intelligence. The girl sat straight and serious, her reddish-brown hair neatly braided, while the boy bounced slightly with barely contained energy. The man climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone whose body had been tested by years of hard work. He removed his hat as he approached the porch, revealing a face marked by recent hardship but maintained dignity. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the soft drawl of someone raised further south. "I'm Cole Mercer. I've come about your advertisement in the paper." Cole Mercer stood at the base of Lydia's porch steps, hat in hand, waiting for her response with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to uncertainty. His worn leather saddlebags hung over his shoulder, containing what remained of his worldly possessions, few changes of clothes, his father's pocket watch, and the deed to land that no longer existed. Lydia studied him with the careful assessment of a woman who had learned not to trust first impressions. He was taller than Samuel had been, with broad shoulders that spoke of years spent handling livestock and heavy work. His clothes were clean but showed the careful mending that suggested limited means. Most telling were his hands scarred and calloused, but steady as he held his hat. "Mr. Mercer," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral, "I believe there may be some misunderstanding. My advertisement was for a housekeeper." A smile touched the corner of his mouth, transforming his weathered features. "Yes, ma'am. I read it carefully. I reckon I can keep house as well as anyone. Been doing it for these two for the better part of 3 years now." He gestured toward the wagon where the twins sat, watching the exchange with bright, intelligent eyes. The girl, Ruth, Lydia would soon learn, had her father's steady gaze, while the boy Rory seemed ready to leap from the wagon seat and explore every corner of the ranch. "Perhaps you should explain your circumstances, Mr. Mercer," Lydia suggested, stepping back from the porch railing but not yet inviting them closer. Cole's expression grew more serious. "Fair enough, ma'am. Won't pretty it up for you." He looked toward the mountains in the distance, gathering his thoughts. "Had a cattle lease down in Paradise Valley. Small operation, but honest work. 3 years ago, my wife Sarah took sick with the fever. Lost her that winter, along with our baby she was carrying." The words were spoken simply, without self-pity, but Lydia heard the carefully controlled pain beneath them. She found herself thinking of Samuel, of her own recent loss. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. Cole nodded his acknowledgement. "The twins were barely 6 then. I kept the lease going, managed to make ends meet. Then this past spring, we had rains like you wouldn't believe. Creek rose overnight and took out the bridge, then kept rising. Lost most of the herd, and what cattle survived, scattered to kingdom come. Landlord decided the risk wasn't worth it anymore, terminated my lease." He shifted the saddlebags to his other shoulder. "Been looking for work ever since. Problem is, most folks see a man with children and figure it's more trouble than it's worth. Children need schooling, need stability. Can't exactly leave them in the wagon while I work someone else's ranch." Lydia glanced at the twins again. Ruth sat with perfect posture, her small hands folded in her lap, while Rory had begun making friends with the mule that pulled their wagon. They looked well cared for despite their obvious hardships, their clothes patched but clean, their faces bright with curiosity rather than the dull acceptance she might have expected from children who had lost so much. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Mercer?" "Room and board for the 3 of us through the winter," he said directly. "In exchange, I'll cook, clean, tend whatever needs tending. I see you've got a house that wants finishing." His eyes moved appreciatively over the solid construction, visible in the frame. "I can handle carpenter work, roofing, whatever needs doing. Kids can help with lighter chores, and Ruth's got away with cooking already. And come spring—" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Come spring, we'll see what opportunities present themselves. Maybe I'll have saved enough to start over somewhere. Maybe you'll decide we're more help than hindrance." The practical part of Lydia's mind was already calculating. A man who could finish Samuel's work on the house would be worth far more than any housekeeper. Someone who understood construction could make the place properly livable before the baby came. And the children, well, children brought life to a place, something this silent ranch house desperately needed. But the other part of her mind, the part shaped by small-town expectations and social conventions, whispered warnings about reputation and propriety. A widow living alone with a man and his children would set tongues wagging from here to Fort Harmony. As if reading her thoughts, Cole added, "I understand your concerns about appearances, Ma'am. I'd be glad to sleep in the old cabin or even the barn if that suits better. All I'm asking for is a chance to prove we can earn our keep." Ruth chose that moment to climb down from the wagon, moving with careful dignity that seemed far older than her years. She approached the porch with her hands clasped behind her back. "Ma'am," she said in a clear, sweet voice, "Papa didn't mention that I can read real good, and I know my numbers. I could help teach your baby when he's old enough, if you'd like." The simple assumption that Lydia would want her child educated, the offer of help with such a fundamental responsibility, touched something deep in Lydia's heart. She looked from Ruth's earnest, freckled face to Cole's steady gaze to young Rory, who had stopped playing with the mule to listen to the conversation. "How do you know it's a boy?" Lydia asked with genuine curiosity. Ruth smiled, and for the first time looked truly like the child she was. "Just a feeling, ma'am. Sometimes you can tell." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward evening, and the practical realities of the situation pressed upon Lydia. These people needed shelter, and she needed help. Whatever the social complications might be, winter would not wait for propriety. "The old cabin where my husband and I lived before starting this house," she said slowly. "It's small, but it's sound. 2 rooms, with a good fireplace and a sound roof. You could make yourselves comfortable there." Cole's relief was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. "That's generous, ma'am. More than generous." "There would be conditions," Lydia continued, her voice growing firmer as she made the decision. "The children must attend school when it's in session. No drinking, no rough language around the youngsters. Sunday is for rest and reflection, and I'll need help with the harvest and preserving before the cold weather sets in." Understood completely. Rory had grown tired of waiting and bounced down from the wagon to join his sister. He had the same reddish-brown hair as Ruth, but where hers was neatly contained, his stuck up in unruly cowlicks despite obvious attempts to tame it. "Is that a real baby in there?" he asked with the directness of childhood, pointing at Lydia's rounded middle. "Rory!" Ruth scolded, her cheeks flaming with embarrassment. But Lydia found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Yes, it's a real baby. He should be here around Christmas time." "Christmas?" Rory's eyes went wide. "That's the best time for babies. Ruth and me were born right before Christmas. Papa says we were the best Christmas present he ever got." Cole ruffled his son's hair affectionately. "That's enough questions for now, boy. Let's get our things settled and see what work needs doing." As the family began unloading their few possessions from the wagon, Lydia watched with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The practical voice in her mind catalogued all the ways this arrangement could go wrong. The gossip, the complications, the risk of becoming too dependent on people who might disappear come spring. But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent, that recognized something in Cole Mercer's steady competence and his children's resilient spirits. It was the voice that had convinced her to marry Samuel despite her father's objections, the voice that had sustained her through 15 years of marriage and 3 months of widowhood. As evening fell over Harmony Valley, smoke began to rise from the chimney of the old cabin for the first time in over a year. Through her kitchen window, Lydia could see warm light glowing in the windows and hear the distant sound of children's laughter mixing with the deeper rumble of their father's voice. For the first time since Samuel's death, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty. The first morning brought the smell of bacon and coffee drifting across the yard from the old cabin, a domestic comfort Lydia hadn't experienced since Samuel's death. She had slept better than she had in months, perhaps because, for the first time in 3 months, she wasn't completely alone on the ranch. Ruth appeared at her kitchen door just after sunrise, carrying a plate covered with a clean dishcloth and wearing an apron that was clearly made for a grown woman, but had been carefully altered to fit her small frame. "Papa thought you might like some breakfast, ma'am," she said with careful formality. "I made biscuits, and there's honey from our last place." The biscuits were golden and light, better than anything Lydia had managed to produce in her current condition. She invited Ruth to sit at the kitchen table while she ate, curious about this serious little girl who seemed to carry responsibilities far beyond her years. "These are wonderful," Lydia said truthfully. "However did you learn to cook so well?" Ruth's face brightened with pleasure at the praise. "Mama taught me before she got sick. Said every girl needed to know how to make a proper biscuit. After she passed, Papa tried his best, but he burns everything." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Don't tell him I said so, but his coffee could strip paint off a barn." Lydia found herself laughing, actually laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Your secret is safe with me. Would you like to help me with some baking today? I need to make bread for the week." The arrangement that developed over the following days felt surprisingly natural. Cole appeared each morning after his children had eaten, ready to work on whatever needed attention. His skill with carpentry became evident immediately as he examined Samuel's unfinished work with the eye of an experienced craftsman. "Your husband knew his business," he told Lydia as they stood in what would eventually be the front parlor. "This framing is solid as bedrock, just needs someone to finish what he started." Cole's respectful references to Samuel touched Lydia deeply. Many men might have felt compelled to criticize another man's work or suggest improvements, but Cole seemed to understand that he was completing a vision rather than imposing his own. The sound of hammering and sawing filled the days now, punctuated by Rory's excited questions and Ruth's more thoughtful observations. The boy had an insatiable curiosity about everything he encountered, from the way water moved in the creek to the reason some trees turned colors before others. "Why do you suppose God made leaves change like that?" he asked Lydia one afternoon as they sat on the porch watching Cole work on the roof. "I think perhaps to remind us that change can be beautiful," she replied, surprising herself with the thought. Ruth had attached herself to Lydia with quiet devotion, eager to help with any task and fascinated by the coming baby. Her handmade doll, a carefully stitched creation with yarn hair and button eyes, became a frequent companion during their conversations about caring for infants. Mama said babies need lots of holding, Ruth confided as she cradled the doll. Said it helps them know they're safe and loved. The doll had clearly been made with more love than skill, its features slightly crooked and its dress patched with different fabrics. But it was treasured, carried everywhere, and treated with the tender care that spoke of a child who understood the value of precious things. Cole maintained a careful distance from Lydia herself, always courteous but never presumptuous. He asked permission before entering the house, inquired about her needs without prying into her private business, and seemed instinctively to understand the boundaries that propriety demanded. Yet there were moments when their interactions carried an undercurrent of something deeper. When he handed her a cup of coffee he had made, considerably better than Ruth had implied, their fingers brushed briefly, and both seemed aware of the contact. When she brought him lunch while he worked on the roof, their conversation lingered longer than strictly necessary. "You're making good progress," she observed, watching him secure a section of shingles with practiced efficiency. "Should have it weatherproof before the first snow," he replied, pausing in his work to look down at her. "This baby of yours won't want to be born into a house with holes in the roof." The casual assumption that he would still be there when the baby arrived sent a flutter of emotion through Lydia that she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. The evenings established their own rhythm. After dinner, which they often shared at the large kitchen table Lydia had insisted upon, Cole would help the children with their lessons while Lydia worked on sewing baby clothes or mending household items. The domesticity of it felt both foreign and deeply satisfying. Rory struggled with his letters, but attacked each lesson with determined enthusiasm. Ruth read far above her grade level and had already discovered Samuel's small library, devouring each book with quiet intensity. "She gets that from her mother," Cole explained one evening, as they watched Ruth curl up in a chair with one of Samuel's agricultural journals. "Sarah could read anything put in front of her. Used to say books were like windows to places she'd never get to see otherwise." The mention of his late wife came naturally, without the sharp pain Lydia still felt when speaking of Samuel. She wondered if time would eventually blunt her grief to that manageable ache, or if the difference lay in the circumstances of their losses. "Do you miss farming?" she asked, curious about his plans beyond the winter. Cole considered the question seriously. "Miss the independence of it, I suppose. Working your own land, making your own decisions, but the lease was never really mine, just borrowed. Always knew it could end." He glanced around the solid walls of her kitchen. "This feels different, more permanent." The conversations they shared in these quiet evening hours revealed more about each other than either might have intended. Cole spoke of growing up in Kansas, of learning carpentry from his father before the cattle business lured him west. Lydia found herself sharing memories of her marriage, of the dreams she and Samuel had built together. 15 years, Cole mused when she mentioned the length of her marriage. "That's a good, long partnership." "We were fortunate," Lydia agreed. "Not everyone gets that kind of happiness." "No," he said quietly, his eyes on the fire crackling in the kitchen stove. "Not everyone does." By the end of the first week, the arrangement had settled into something that felt less like an emergency measure and more like a natural way of living. The children had claimed favorite spots around the property. Ruth loved the garden, where she helped Lydia harvest the last vegetables, while Rory had discovered a family of ground squirrels near the barn and spent hours observing their behavior. Cole's presence brought a sense of security Lydia hadn't realized she was missing. The simple knowledge that capable hands were available for heavy lifting, that someone else was sharing the responsibility of daily decisions, eased a burden she had carried alone for too long. But with the comfort came complexity. When Mrs. Patterson from town stopped by to deliver some fabric Lydia had ordered, her eyes took in every detail of the domestic scene: Ruth helping in the kitchen, Rory playing in the yard, Cole visible on the roof above. "My, you certainly have made some changes," Mrs. Patterson observed with the particular tone that small-town women used when they had opinions but weren't quite ready to voice them directly. "Mr. Mercer and his children are helping me prepare for winter," Lydia replied evenly. "It's a practical arrangement." "Oh, I'm sure it's very practical," Mrs. Patterson agreed, her smile a bit too bright. "Very practical indeed." After she left, Lydia found herself wondering how many other conversations were taking place in town about her practical arrangement. The thought troubled her more than she cared to admit, not because she questioned the propriety of what they were doing, but because she recognized how much she had already come to depend on Cole and his children being there. Samuel's wedding ring sat on Lydia's dresser each night, a constant reminder of the life she had built and lost. Some mornings she would catch herself reaching for it automatically, the habit of 15 years not easily broken. But increasingly, she found herself looking at it thoughtfully rather than putting it on immediately, as if its weight had somehow changed. The second week brought the first real test of their arrangement when Lydia woke before dawn with sharp pains in her back and a tightness in her belly that sent waves of panic through her. It was too early, the baby wasn't due for another 2 months. She lay in bed for nearly an hour, trying to convince herself it was nothing, before the pains grew strong enough to make her cry out. Cole appeared at her door within minutes, still pulling on his shirt, his hair disheveled from sleep. "Mrs. Hartwell, Ruth heard you call out." "I think," another pain cut off her words, and she doubled over, gripping the edge of her dresser. "Easy now," Cole said, his voice calm but alert. "Let's get you sitting down." He helped her to the chair by her window, then knelt beside her with the assured manner of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies before. "Tell me what you're feeling." The pains subsided after an hour, but they left, Lydia shaken, and Cole quietly determined to take no chances with her health. He sent Rory to town for Doc Morrison, while he and Ruth settled Lydia in the kitchen with her feet up and a cup of warm tea. "Probably just the baby settling," Doc Morrison pronounced after his examination, but his expression remained serious. "At your age, Mrs. Hartwell, we can't be too careful. I want you resting more, working less, no heavy lifting, no long periods on your feet." After the doctor left, Cole found Lydia in the kitchen, staring out the window at the half-finished house with an expression of such deep frustration that it made his heart ache. "I can't be an invalid for 2 months, she said without looking at him. "There's too much to do, too much that needs finishing." "Then we'll finish it," Cole replied simply. "That's what we're here for." The scare had shifted something in their relationship, made them more aware of how much they had come to depend on each other. Cole began checking on Lydia more frequently, ensuring she was resting as the doctor had ordered. Ruth appointed herself Lydia's constant companion, chattering about her day while helping with lighter tasks. "You know," Ruth said one afternoon as they worked on baby clothes together, "I've been thinking about names for the baby. What do you think of Samuel after your husband?" The suggestion caught Lydia off guard. She had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it from Ruth's lips made it feel less like dwelling in the past and more like honoring a good man's memory. "I think," Lydia said carefully, "that would be a fine name for a baby born in this house." Cole's reaction to overhearing this conversation was carefully neutral, but Lydia caught something in his expression that suggested he understood the significance of the decision. He never offered opinions about the baby's name or made assumptions about his role in the child's life, but his attention to detail censuring the nursery would be warm and safe. Building a cradle with his own hands spoke of someone who cared deeply about the outcome. The work on the house progressed steadily despite the shortened days and cooler weather. Cole proved to be not just competent, but genuinely skilled, solving problems Samuel had left unfinished with creative solutions that maintained the integrity of the original design. "Your husband was a fine carpenter," he told Lydia one evening as they reviewed the day's progress. "But he was thinking like a man who had all the time in the world. We need to think like people who have a baby coming." The shift in pronouns from "your husband" to "we" didn't escape Lydia's notice. Somehow, without either of them quite acknowledging it, Cole had begun to speak of the baby's arrival as a shared concern rather than her solitary responsibility. Rory had thrown himself into the project with characteristic enthusiasm, appointed himself Cole's assistant, and taking the responsibility seriously. He fetched tools, held boards steady, and peppered his father with questions about every aspect of construction. "Why do the boards have to be that exact distance apart?" he asked one afternoon, watching Cole measure and mark with meticulous precision. "Because," Cole explained patiently, "if they're too far apart, the wind will whistle through the walls and make the baby cold. If they're too close together, we waste wood and money. Everything in building is about balance, son." The lessons extended beyond carpentry. Watching Cole with his children, Lydia began to understand the kind of father he was: patient, instructive, affectionate, without being indulgent. He expected responsibility from them, but tempered it with understanding of their age and circumstances. Ruth had begun to confide in Lydia about her dreams and fears, sharing the perspective of a child who had grown up too fast, but still carried the hopes of youth. "Do you think we'll stay here?" she asked one evening as they sat by the kitchen fire, her doll cradled in her arms. "Would you like to stay?" Ruth nodded earnestly. "It feels like home here. Not like the other places we've been since Mama died. Those were just places to sleep. This feels like somewhere we belong." The conversation troubled Lydia long after Ruth had gone to bed. She found herself wanting to promise the child that they would always have a home here, but the practical part of her mind reminded her that she had no idea what Cole's long-term plans might be. The question of permanence hung unspoken between the adults, present in every shared glance and collaborative decision. When Cole built shelves for the baby's room, was he thinking of a temporary arrangement or a lasting one? When Lydia found herself planning meals around his preferences, was she simply being a good hostess or something more? The answer came in small revelations: Cole's gentle correction of Rory's table manners, delivered with the assumption that such lessons mattered for the boy's future. Lydia's automatic inclusion of the twins in her prayers each night, as if they had become part of her spiritual responsibility. The way they had all begun to speak of "when the baby comes," rather than "when your baby comes." Samuel's ring remained on the dresser, but Lydia found herself looking at it less often, its symbolic weight somehow lighter. She wasn't ready to put it away, might never be ready for that, but its presence had become less about holding on to the past and more about honoring what had been while remaining open to what might be. One evening, as October painted the aspens gold and the first frost warned of winter's approach, Lydia found Cole on the front porch, studying the mountains by moonlight. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling carefully into the chair beside him. "Just thinking about the winter ahead," he replied, "making sure we're ready for whatever comes." "Are you worried about something specific?" Cole was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about what Doc Morrison said, about you needing help when the baby comes. I know you're planning to have Mrs. Patterson assist, but if the weather's bad, if she can't get here in time—" "You've delivered babies before," Lydia said. It wasn't a question. "A few times, animals mostly, but I helped with the twins when Sarah went into labor early. Doc was snowed in for 3 days. He turned to look at her. I want you to know that if it comes to that, you won't be alone." The simple promise carried weight beyond its words. In that moment, Lydia understood that Cole Mercer wasn't just a temporary solution to her practical problems. He was someone who had chosen to invest in her future and her child's well-being, regardless of what that might mean for his own plans. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant it for far more than just his willingness to help with the birth. The night sounds of the valley surrounded them, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind in the grass, the soft murmur of the creek. It was a peaceful sound, the sound of home, and for the first time since Samuel's death, Lydia felt truly at peace with the changes that lay ahead. The bronze church bell of Fort Harmony tolled 11 times as Cole helped Lydia down from the wagon on their first trip to town together as a household. The timing was deliberate. Sunday service would be ending soon, and the main street would fill with families emerging from the white-painted church, their conversations carrying on the crisp October air. Lydia had agonized over this excursion for days. The practical necessities couldn't be avoided. They needed supplies before winter, and the children required shoes and warmer clothes. But she knew that their first public appearance together would set the tone for how the community viewed their arrangement. Ruth and Rory climbed down from the wagon bed with barely contained excitement. They had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of ranch life, and the prospect of seeing other children, of browsing the general store's treasures, had kept them chattering throughout the journey to town. "Remember what we discussed," Cole said quietly to the twins. "Best behavior and answer questions politely, but don't volunteer information about our business." The warning proved prescient. They had barely tied the horses to the hitching post outside Patterson's general store when the church doors opened and the congregation began to emerge. Lydia recognized most of the faces neighbors she had known for years, people who had attended her wedding to Samuel and offered condolences at his funeral. Mrs. Patterson appeared at the store's entrance, her smile bright and curious as she took in the family group. "Why, Lydia dear, how lovely to see you in town. And these must be the children you mentioned." The phrasing was careful, designed to extract information without seeming intrusive. Lydia met it with equal diplomacy. "Yes, this is Ruth and Rory Mercer, and their father Cole. They've been helping me prepare for winter." "How thoughtful," Mrs. Patterson said, her eyes moving from Cole's respectful but reserved expression to the way he positioned himself slightly behind Lydia, clearly deferring to her lead in social situations. "I do hope you'll introduce them around. We always like to welcome new families to the community." The words were kind, but Lydia caught the slight emphasis on families and understood the subtext. The community was prepared to accept Cole and his children, provided they understood their place in the established social order. Inside the store, Ruth and Rory marveled at the displays of ribbon and candy, while Cole and Lydia attended to practical purchases. Their shopping list was carefully planned: flour, sugar, coffee, and the heavier supplies that would see them through the winter months, when trips to town would be difficult or impossible. "That's quite a substantial order," Mr. Patterson observed as Cole loaded 50-pound sacks of flour into the wagon. "Planning to do a lot of baking, are we?" "With a baby coming and winter ahead, it pays to be prepared," Lydia replied evenly. As they worked, other townspeople found reasons to pause and greet Lydia, their curiosity about her companions barely concealed behind polite conversation. Most were genuinely kind. These were her neighbors, people who had known her for years and wished her well. But Lydia was aware of the undercurrent of speculation in their questions. "Your helper seems very capable," commented Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, watching Cole secure their purchases with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Mercer is an experienced carpenter," Lydia replied. "He's been invaluable in preparing the house for the baby." The conversation might have continued in that vein, carefully polite and deliberately neutral, if not for the arrival of Ezra Whitman. Whitman owned the largest ranch in the valley and had always harbored ambitions to expand his holdings. Samuel had rebuffed his offers to buy their land multiple times, and Whitman had made no secret of his belief that a woman alone couldn't manage ranch property effectively. "Well, well," Whitman said, his voice carrying across the store with deliberate volume. "Lydia Hartwell and her new household arrangements." The word household was loaded with innuendo that made Lydia's cheeks flush with anger rather than embarrassment. She felt Cole stiffen beside her, but his voice remained calm when he spoke. "Mr. Whitman, I presume? I'm Cole Mercer. Mrs. Hartwell has been kind enough to provide my children and me with work and shelter for the winter." Whitman looked Cole up and down with undisguised contempt. "How convenient for you, finding yourself a place to spend the cold months with a woman who needs protection." The implication was clear and insulting. Lydia stepped forward before Cole could respond, her voice carrying the authority of someone defending her own property and decisions. "Mr. Whitman, I suggest you be very careful with your words. Mr. Mercer is helping me complete the house my husband began, nothing more and nothing less. If you have concerns about my ability to manage my affairs, you're welcome to discuss them with my banker, who will be happy to confirm that my accounts are in excellent order." The public nature of the confrontation had drawn attention from other shoppers, and Whitman seemed to realize he had overstepped. His smile became forced as he attempted to retreat gracefully. "Of course, my dear. I'm sure your arrangement is entirely proper. I was simply expressing concern for your welfare, as any neighbor would. Your concern is noted and unnecessary, Lydia replied crisply. After Whitman left, the atmosphere in the store remained tense. Lydia was aware of whispered conversations and sideways glances, the sort of small-town scrutiny that could make or break a person's reputation. But she was also aware of expressions of support, Mrs. Henderson's approving nod, Mr. Patterson's gruff comment about some folks having too much time to mind other people's business. The twins had witnessed the exchange with wide eyes, understanding enough to know their father had been insulted but not quite grasping the full implications. Cole's handling of the situation, calm, dignified, protective of Lydia's reputation rather than his own had, impressed even those who might have been inclined to judge their arrangement harshly. As they prepared to leave town, Reverend Henderson approached their wagon. He was a thoughtful man in his 60s, someone who had known Lydia since her marriage to Samuel and had conducted the funeral service that still brought tears to her eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, "I hope you know that you and your household are welcome in our church any time you care to attend. The Lord's house has room for all who seek it." The invitation was clearly extended to include Cole and the twins, and Lydia felt a wave of gratitude for the minister's tactful way of offering community acceptance. "Thank you, Reverend. I hope we'll be able to attend services soon." On the drive home, the twins chatted about their impressions of town life, but Cole remained thoughtfully quiet. Finally, as they crested the hill that brought their valley into view, he spoke. "I'm sorry about what happened back there, about the position it puts you in." Lydia considered her response carefully. "Cole, I made the decision to invite you and your children to stay. I did it with full knowledge that some people would find reasons to criticize. I won't have you apologizing for existing in the space I offered you. Still, I know it's not easy being the subject of speculation." "No," Lydia agreed, watching the golden afternoon light play across their fields. "But I've learned that people will talk regardless of what you do. The question is whether you're living according to your own conscience or according to their expectations." Ruth and Rory had fallen asleep in the wagon bed, exhausted by the excitement of their town adventure. In the quiet that followed, Lydia found herself thinking about the confrontation with Whitman and the various reactions it had provoked. The truth was that her relationship with Cole and his children had evolved beyond the simple business arrangement she had originally envisioned. They were becoming something more complex, not quite a family, but certainly more than employer and employees. The boundaries were blurring in ways that probably should have concerned her more than they did. But as they turned into the lane leading to the ranch, and she saw the house with its completed roof and the cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, Lydia felt nothing but rightness about the choices she had made. Let the town speculate all it wanted. She had found something precious in this arrangement: companionship, help, hope for the future, and she wasn't about to sacrifice it for the comfort of conventional appearances. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a simple supper, Ruth surprised them all with a question that had clearly been on her mind since their town visit. "Why was that man so angry about us being here?" Cole and Lydia exchanged glances, each wondering how to explain adult prejudices and social conventions to a 9-year-old. "Some people," Cole said finally, "think they know the right way for other people to live their lives. When they see something different from what they expect, it makes them uncomfortable." "But we're not doing anything wrong," Rory protested with the indignation of childhood. "No, you're not," Lydia said firmly. "And don't let anyone tell you differently. Sometimes doing the right thing means doing things differently than people expect." The conversation settled something for all of them. They were building something here, not just completing a house, but creating a home. And if that made some people uncomfortable, well, that was their burden to bear. Not something that should dictate the choices of 4 people trying to build a life together. Later that night, as Lydia prepared for bed, she found herself looking at Samuel's ring on her dresser with new understanding. The gold band caught the lamplight, but it no longer seemed to reproach her for the changes in her life. Instead, it seemed to remind her of the capacity for love and partnership that Samuel had awakened in her, qualities that didn't have to die with him. Outside her window, she could see the warm glow from the cabin where Cole was probably helping the twins with their evening prayers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work to be done, new moments of connection and conflict. But tonight, for the first time since Samuel's death, Lydia felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The trunk of baby clothes sat open in what would soon be the nursery, its contents carefully arranged by Lydia's patient hands over the long months of pregnancy. Tiny gowns and blankets, booties no bigger than a man's thumb, caps that would barely cover a doll's hediac piece, represented hours of careful stitching by lamplight, hope made tangible through needle and thread. Ruth knelt beside the trunk with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects, her small fingers tracing the delicate embroidery Lydia had worked into the collars and cuffs. "Did you make all of these yourself?" she asked in wonder. "Most of them," Lydia replied, settling carefully into the rocking chair Cole had carried upstairs for her. At 7 months along, her movements had become deliberate and calculated, each position chosen for maximum comfort and minimum strain. Some were gifts from ladies in town when they learned about the baby. The nursery was nearly complete now, transformed from Samuel's vision of a guest room into something warm and welcoming for an infant. Cole had installed extra insulation in the walls to keep out winter drafts, and the windows faced east to catch the morning sun. A small stove in the corner would provide additional warmth during the coldest nights. "Papa says babies need lots of warmth," Ruth observed, carefully folding a tiny blanket. "He says that's the most important thing after food and love." "Your papa is a wise man." Ruth's face grew serious in the way that children's faces do when they're working up courage to ask something important. "Mrs. Hartwell, after the baby comes, will you still want us here?" The question pierced Lydia's heart. She set down the small cap she had been mending and looked at Ruth directly. "Oh, sweetheart, why would you think otherwise?" "Because now you need help, but after the baby's born, maybe you won't need us anymore. And people in town don't seem to like us being here very much." Lydia reached for Ruth's hand, pulling the child closer to her chair. "Listen to me very carefully, Ruth Mercer. You and Rory and your father have become part of this place. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. Do you understand?" Relief flooded Ruth's features, but uncertainty still lingered. "What about Papa? Does he want to stay?" It was a question Lydia had been asking herself with increasing frequency as winter approached and the baby's due date drew nearer. Cole had never spoken of plans beyond seeing her safely through the birth, though his actions suggested a man thinking in terms of permanence rather than temporary arrangements. "I think," Lydia said carefully, "that your papa is exactly where he wants to be, but if you're worried about it, perhaps you should ask him." That evening brought the first real snow of the season, fat flakes that drifted past the kitchen windows like down from heaven's pillows. The family gathered around the table after supper, Ruth and Rory working on their lessons, while Cole repaired a harness and Lydia worked on the final baby blanket. The domestic scene had become so natural that none of them remarked on it anymore. Cole's presence at their table, his quiet authority in helping the children with their studies, the way Lydia automatically poured his coffee without ask and gall of it, had evolved so gradually that it felt like it had always been this way. "Mrs. Hartwell," Rory said, looking up from his arithmetic slate, "when the baby comes, will he be our brother?" The question hung in the air like the snow, out beautiful, transformative, and impossible to ignore. Cole's hands stilled on the leather he was mending, and Lydia felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy. "Well," she said slowly, "what do you think about that?" "I think yes," Rory said decisively. "We live in the same place. We eat together. We take care of each other. That's what families do." "Families are people who choose to love each other," Ruth added with the solemnity that made her seem older than her years, "even if they're not born related." Cole's eyes met Lydia's across the table, and in that moment she saw her own feelings reflected back at Hearth, careful hope, the deepening affection, the sense of rightness that had been growing between them like the child growing beneath her heart. "I think," Lydia said quietly, "that you're both very wise children." Later, after the twins had been sent to bed and the kitchen was clean, Cole and Lydia found themselves alone by the dying fire. These moments had become precious to both of them, the quiet hours when they could speak freely without the careful boundaries that daylight seemed to require. "Lydia," Cole said, his voice unusually hesitant, "I need to tell you something. About my plans, about what I'm thinking for the future." Her heart began to beat faster, though whether from hope or fear she couldn't say. "What is it?" "I've been setting aside money from the work I do around the valley, small jobs, helping neighbors with repairs and such. I've got enough saved now to make a start somewhere, maybe lease some land come spring." The words felt like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples of panic through Lydia's carefully constructed peace. "I see. The thing is," Cole continued, and now his voice was steadier, more certain, "I don't want to start over somewhere else. I want to start over here, if you'll have us. Not as your hired help, but as something more permanent." Lydia's breath caught. "Cole, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between fixing your roof and watching you with my children, I've fallen in love with you, Lydia Hartwell. I'm saying that I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing. I'm saying that I want to be here when your baby is born, and I want to help raise him alongside Ruth and Rory." The confession hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite sure the other was ready to cross. Lydia's hands moved instinctively to her rounded belly, where Samuel's child grew strong and active. "I loved Samuel," she said quietly. "I know you did. I loved Sarah. But love isn't a finite thing, is it? Having loved before doesn't mean we can't love again. The baby would be mine in every way that matters, if you'd let me claim him. A man doesn't have to father a child to be his papa." Lydia closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. Not just marriage, but partnership. Not just acceptance of her circumstances, but embrace of them. A ready-made family for the children who had already claimed places in her heart. And a father for the son who would never know his biological parent. The town will adjust. People always do, eventually. When she opened her eyes, Cole was watching her with patient intensity, as if he understood that this decision would reshape all their lives and was prepared to wait as long as necessary for her answer. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course you do. This isn't a decision to be made lightly." But as Cole banked the fire and prepared to return to the cabin, as Lydia climbed the stairs to her empty bedroom where Samuel's ring waited on the dresser, she realized that the decision had already been made. It had been made in 100 small moments, every shared meal, every quiet conversation, every time she had looked at Cole with his children and felt her heart expand with affection and admiration. She was in love with Cole Mercer. Had been for weeks, if she was honest with herself. The question wasn't whether she wanted what he was offering, but whether she had the courage to reach for it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in pristine white. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new decisions, new steps toward a future none of them had planned, but all of them seemed to want. For tonight, it was enough to know that the offer had been made, that the words had been spoken, that the possibility of happiness stretched before them like fresh snow waiting for footprints. The legal document arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered by a grim-faced clerk from the territorial courthouse who seemed eager to complete his unpleasant task and return to town before the threatening clouds released their burden of snow. Lydia signed for the envelope with trembling hands, though she had no premonition of the devastation its contents would bring to her carefully ordered world. Cole was on the roof putting the finishing touches on the chimney work when he heard her cry out. The sound draw, anguished, completely unlike anything he had ever heard from her, sent him scrambling down the ladder with reckless haste. He found her in the kitchen, the official papers scattered across the table where they had fallen from her nerveless fingers. Her face was white as the fresh snow beginning to dust the windows, and she was gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Lydia, what is it?" She gestured helplessly at the documents, unable to speak. Cole gathered them carefully, his carpenter's hands surprisingly gentle as he smoothed the creased pages and began to read. The legal language was formal and cold, but its meaning was devastatingly clear. Samuel Hartwell had owed substantial money to investors in Denver who had funded his plans to expand the ranch operation. The debt, secured by the ranch property itself, had somehow escaped Lydia's notice during the months of settling Samuel's affairs. $15,000? Cole read aloud, his voice growing grimmer with each word. Plus interest and legal fees, payment demanded within 60 days, or the property will be subject to immediate foreclosure proceedings. "I don't understand," Lydia whispered, sinking into her chair with the careful movements of someone afraid they might shatter. "Samuel never mentioned any investors. He handled all the business dealings. I thought everything was paid for." Cole continued reading, piecing together the story from the legal documents and attached correspondence. Samuel had borrowed against the ranch to purchase livestock and equipment for an expansion that would have doubled their operation. The plan had been ambitious but sound except that Samuel had died before any of it could be implemented, leaving behind a pregnant widow and a debt that she knew nothing about. "Why didn't this come to light before now?" Cole asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The letter says Samuel had been making payments through a bank in Denver. When the payments stopped after his death, it took months for them to track down the estate." Lydia's voice was hollow with shock. "They sent notices to an address in Denver that Samuel apparently used for business correspondence. I never knew anything about it." Cole set the papers down and moved to crouch beside Lydia's chair, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "We'll figure this out. There has to be a solution." $15,000, Cole. "I don't have $15,000. I barely have 1,500. The magnitude of the debt seemed to hit her anew, and she doubled over as if physically struck. "They're going to take everything. The ranch, the house, everything Samuel worked for. Everything we dreamed of." The twins appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of distress they didn't understand, but recognized as significant. Ruth's eyes went immediately to the scattered papers, while Rory moved to Lydia's side with the instinctive protectiveness of a child who had learned early that the adults in his life were not invulnerable. "What's wrong?" Ruth asked quietly. Cole looked at Lydia, who seemed incapable of speech, then made a quick decision. "Come sit down, both of you. We need to talk about something important." He explained the situation in terms the children could understand, watching their faces change from confusion to worry to the particular kind of fear that came from having lost a home before. When he finished, the kitchen was silent except for the wind picking up outside and the soft sound of Lydia's suppressed weeping. "So we have to leave?" Rory asked finally. "I don't know, son. We're going to do everything we can to prevent that." Ruth, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "What about the money you've been saving, Papa? You said you had enough to make a start somewhere." Cole's throat tightened. The money Ruth was referring to, his carefully hoarded savings from odd jobs, and the small salary Lydia insisted on paying him amounted to perhaps $800. It was the foundation he had planned to build a future on, the means by which he had hoped to court Lydia as a man of independent means, rather than as someone dependent on her charity. "It's not nearly enough, sweetheart." But Lydia had lifted her head at Ruth's words, and Cole could see her mind working through the possibilities and obstacles. "Cole, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. But it's your future, your children's security. Our future is here, with you and the baby. What good is money if we lose the people we want to spend it on?" The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was Reverend Henderson, his face grave with concern as he stamped snow from his boots. "Mrs. Hartwell, I came as soon as I heard. News like this travels fast in a small town." The irony was bitter. Their private business, which they had tried so hard to keep dignified and proper, was now the subject of public speculation and pity. Lydia straightened in her chair, gathering the remnants of her composure. "Reverend Henderson, thank you for coming. I want you to know that the church community is prepared to help in whatever way we can. We've already begun taking up a collection." The kindness in his voice nearly broke Lydia's fragile control. That's very generous, but I couldn't possibly accept charity. It's not charity, my dear. It's community. It's neighbors helping neighbors. Henderson's eyes moved to include Cole and the twins in his statement. All of you are part of this community now. After the minister left, promising to return the next day with whatever funds the congregation could gather, the four of them sat around the kitchen table trying to calculate possibilities. Even with Cole's savings and whatever the church could raise, they would still be thousands of dollars short. There might be another way, Cole said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke. I still have contacts from my ranching days. Men who might be willing to invest in a working operation, especially if they could be assured of competent management. You mean take on more debt? Lydia asked. I mean take on partners, people who would share the risk and the profits. Cole was thinking out loud now, his carpenter's methodical mind applying itself to this new kind of construction project. The land is good, the water rights are solid. With proper backing, this could be exactly the kind of operation Samuel envisioned. It was a slender hope, but it was hope nonetheless. As night fell and the snow continued to accumulate outside, they began to plan. Cole would travel to Billings to meet with potential investors. Lydia would gather every document related to the ranch's assets and debts. The twins would help maintain the property and support Lydia during what was bound to be a stressful time. There's one more thing, Cole said as they prepared to part for the night. If this works, if we can save the ranch, I want to do it right. I want to marry you, Lydia. Before the baby comes, before spring, before anyone can question our right to be a family. Lydia looked at him across the table, this man, who was willing to risk everything he had for her and her unborn child, who was offering not just financial salvation, but emotional partnership. Are you proposing to me in the middle of a financial crisis, Cole Mercer? I'm proposing to you because of who you are, not because of your circumstances. The crisis just makes me realize how much I don't want to face the future without you. The answer was yes, had been yes, since the moment he first offered to court her properly. But saying it aloud, in front of the children who would become her stepchildren, and with Samuel's ring still on her finger, felt like stepping across a threshold from which there would be no return. Yes, she said simply, yes to all of it. Outside, the storm was intensifying, but inside the kitchen of the half-finished house, four people who had found each other by accident were choosing to become a family by design. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The cast-iron stove dominated the kitchen like a benevolent giant, its firebox glowing red-hot against the December cold that pressed against every window and door. Around it, the family that had chosen each other gathered for what might be their last meal together in this house, though none of them spoke the possibility aloud. Cole had returned from Billings 3 days earlier with news that was both hopeful and sobering. He had found investors, cattle buyers from Chicago who were interested in establishing a Montana operation, but their offer fell short of the full amount needed. Combined with the church collection and Cole's savings, they were still $3,000 short of what the Denver creditors demanded. $3,000 might as well be $30,000, Lydia had said when Cole delivered the news, but she had said it without despair. The past weeks had taught her that some things were more valuable than money, more lasting than property. Now, watching Ruth carefully baste the Christmas goose that would be their celebration regardless of their uncertain future, Lydia felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with their financial circumstances. This kitchen, warmed by the stove that had become the heart of their home, filled with the voices of people who had learned to care for each other, this was what Samuel had dreamed of when he planned this house. Not the building itself, but the life it would contain. The gravy's ready, Rory announced, standing on a chair to stir the pan with intense concentration. At 9, he had become surprisingly competent in the kitchen, motivated by pride in contributing to the household and by his passionate love of good food. Careful with that spoon, Ruth cautioned, ever the responsible older sister. Remember what happened last time. The last time had resulted in gravy on the ceiling and Rory confined to washing dishes for a week, but it had also produced laughter that echoed through the house for hours afterward. These small domestic dramas had become precious to all of them. the stuff of family stories that would be told for years to come. Cole emerged from the pantry, carrying a bottle of wine he had been serving a gift from the minister's wife when news of their engagement had made its way through the community. The announcement had been met with varying degrees of approval and disapproval, but Reverend Henderson had agreed to perform the ceremony on Christmas Eve, just 4 days away. "Whatever happens with the ranch," Cole had told Lydia privately, "we'll face it as husband and wife." The practical advantages of marriage were clear. It would give Cole legal standing to negotiate on behalf of the property, and it would provide social legitimacy for their living arrangement. But the emotional truth was simpler. They had fallen in love with the people they had become together, and they wanted to make that commitment permanent. Lydia, now 8 months pregnant and moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo, supervised the final preparations for their feast. The baby had been active all day, as if excited by the festive atmosphere, and she found herself pausing frequently to rest her hand on her belly and marvel at the strong movements within. "He's eager to join the party," she murmured, as a particularly vigorous kick made her catch her breath. "Maybe he knows something we don't," Cole suggested, moving to stand behind her chair and rest his hands gently on her shoulders. "Maybe he's planning to be our Christmas miracle." The idea of the baby arriving on Christmas Day had occurred to all of them, though Doc Morrison had cautioned that first babies often arrived late rather than early. Still, Lydia had been experiencing intermittent contractions for several days, nothing regular or intense enough to cause alarm, but enough to remind her that the birth was approaching quickly. "Doc Morrison said he'd stay close to town through the holidays," Ruth said, demonstrating the uncanny ability children had for following adult thoughts. "Just in case." The doctor's promise was reassuring, but they all knew that December weather could make travel impossible at short notice. The past week had brought alternating snow and freezing rain that had made the roads treacherous and left a coating of ice on everything exposed to the elements. Their preparations for the birth had been thorough and methodical. The nursery was complete and warmed by its own small stove. Clean linens and towels were stacked in readiness. Cole had even fashioned a special bell that Lydia could ring from her bedroom to summon help if needed during the night. More importantly, they had prepared emotionally for the possibility that the baby might arrive without medical assistance. Cole's experience with animal births and his steady presence during Lydia's earlier scare had given them all confidence that he could manage if necessary. Ruth had appointed herself the official assistant, studying every book about childbirth she could find and practicing her skills at keeping water hot and supplies organized. As they sat down to their Christmas dinner 3 days early, the conversation naturally turned to the future they were about to embrace together. "After we're married," Lydia said, raising her glass of milk in a toast, "we'll need to decide what to call each other. I mean, Ruth and Rory can't very well keep calling me Mrs. Hartwell." "What would you like us to call you?" Ruth asked seriously. Lydia considered the question carefully. She would never try to replace the children's memory of their mother, but she wanted to establish her own special relationship with them. "What about Mama Lydia?" she suggested. "That way you can remember your first Mama and still have a name for me." The children exchanged glances, conducting one of those silent conversations that twins seem to specialize in. "We'd like that," Ruth said finally. "Mama Lydia." Cole cleared his throat, and Lydia could see that he was struggling with emotion. The sight of his children accepting her so completely, the reality of the family they were creating together, seemed to overwhelm him at unexpected moments. "And what will the baby call me?" he asked quietly. "Papa," Rory said without hesitation. "Just Papa, same as us." After dinner, as they cleaned up together with the easy cooperation that had become their habit, Lydia felt a sharp pain across her lower back that made her pause with her hands braced against the sink. "Lydia!" Cole was beside her immediately, his hands steadying her. "It's nothing," she said, though the pain had been stronger than the mild contractions she had been experiencing. "Just the baby reminding me he's still in there." But over the next hour, as they played cards by the fire and listened to Ruth read aloud from one of Samuel's books, the pains returned with increasing frequency. By 9 o'clock, they were coming every 10 minutes and lasting long enough that Lydia had to stop whatever she was doing to breathe through them. "This might be it," Cole said quietly, taking her hands as another contraction peaked. "It's too early," Lydia protested, though she knew that babies arrived on their own schedule regardless of human convenience. "Ruth, get the lantern and check the weather," Cole instructed calmly. "Rory, make sure the fires are built up in both stoves." Ruth returned from the window with a grim expression. "It's snowing hard, Papa, really hard, and the wind is picking up." Through the kitchen window, they could see that what had been a gentle snowfall during dinner had intensified into a serious storm. The wind was driving the snow horizontal, and already the tracks from Cole's earlier trip to check on the animals were filling in. "No one's traveling in this weather," Cole said, stating what they all understood. "Looks like we're on our own." Lydia felt a flutter of fear, quickly replaced by determination. Women had been having babies without doctors for thousands of years. She was strong, the baby was healthy, and she was surrounded by people who loved her. Whatever happened, they would manage. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than the others, and as it passed, she looked around at the faces of her chosen family. "Well then," she said with a calmness that surprised even her, "I suppose we'd better get ready to welcome this baby home." Outside, the storm intensified, sealing them in their warm cocoon of preparation and love. Inside, 3 people who had found each other by chance prepared to welcome a 4th member to their unconventional family. Whatever the next hours brought, they would face it together, bound by something stronger than law or convention, the simple, powerful choice to love and protect each other no matter what came. Samuel's medical kit sat open on the dresser in Lydia's bedroom, its contents laid out with the precision of a surgical instrument tray. The leather case had belonged to Samuel's father, who had served as a field medic during the war, and though its supplies were basic, they represented the difference between preparation and hope. Cole moved through the room with quiet efficiency, lighting additional lamps and stoking the small stove until the bedroom glowed with warmth and light. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, rattling the windows and sending wind-driven snow against the glass in waves that sounded like handfuls of sand being thrown against the house. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, breathing through another contraction, while Ruth held her hand and counted seconds. The pains were coming every 5 minutes now, each one stronger and longer than the last, announcing with unmistakable authority that this baby would not wait for convenient timing or ideal circumstances. 60 seconds, Ruth announced as the contraction passed, her young voice steady despite the magnitude of the responsibility she had accepted. "That's the longest one yet." "You're doing fine," Cole assured Lydia, though his own tension was evident in the careful control of his voice. "Everything's progressing normally." His confidence was partly real and partly performance for the sake of everyone's nerves, but it was grounded in genuine experience. He had assisted with difficult animal births countless times, and he had been present when the twins were born during a similar snowstorm that had isolated them from medical help. The principles were the same, even if the stakes felt infinitely higher. Rory appeared in the doorway carrying an armload of clean towels, his freckled face serious with concentration. "I got all the towels from the linen closet, and I put more water on to heat like you asked." "Good boy," Cole praised. "Now I need you to check on the animals one more time, make sure they have enough hay and water to last through the storm." The task was partly necessary and partly a way to keep Rory occupied with useful work rather than letting him dwell on anxieties he was too young to properly understand. The boy nodded importantly and disappeared back down the stairs, eager to prove his worth in this adult crisis. Another contraction gripped Lydia, this one strong enough to make her cry out despite her efforts to remain quiet. She gripped Ruth's hand so tightly that the girl winced, but Ruth didn't pull away, understanding instinctively that her strength was needed. "It's getting harder," Lydia gasped as the pain receded. "They're getting much harder." Cole knelt beside the bed, taking Lydia's free hand in both of his. "That means the baby's getting ready to come. Your body knows what to do, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. The reassurance was exactly what Lydia needed to hear. She had read about childbirth, had listened to other women's stories, but the reality of labor was unlike anything she had imagined. The intensity of the contractions, the way they seemed to take control of her entire body, the feeling of being swept along by forces beyond her influence, it was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "Tell me about when the twins were born," she requested during the brief respite between contractions. She needed distraction, needed to focus on something other than the mounting pressure and pain. Cole's expression softened as he remembered. "It was a night a lot like this one, actually. Sarah had been having pains all day, but we thought it was just the baby settling. Then around midnight, everything changed all at once." He continued the story as Lydia worked through another contraction, his voice providing an anchor of calm in the storm of sensation that was overwhelming her. Ruth listened intently, absorbing every detail about the night of her own birth, while Lydia found comfort in the knowledge that Cole had successfully navigated this crisis before. "Sarah was so brave," Cole concluded, "just like you're being now." "I don't feel brave," Lydia admitted. "I feel like I'm being torn apart from the inside." "That's exactly how you're supposed to feel," Ruth said with a matter-of-fact tone that made her seem far older than her 9 years. "Mama told me once that having a baby is like letting God remake you from the inside out." The wisdom in those words, coming from a child who had lost her mother but still carried her teachings, brought tears to Lydia's eyes. She squeezed Ruth's hand gratefully, amazed by the strength and maturity of this little girl who had already lived through more loss and change than many adults. Rory returned from his mission with a report that the animals were secure and a warning that the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind had picked up, and the snow was now falling so heavily that he could barely see the barn from the house. "We're completely cut off," he announced with the dramatic flair that 9-year-old boys brought to everything. "Nobody's getting through this until it stops." The isolation that might have been frightening under other circumstances felt almost protective now. The 4 of them were sealed into their warm sanctuary, removed from the outside world and its complications, focused entirely on the monumental task at hand. As midnight approached, Lydia's labor intensified dramatically. The contractions were coming every 2 minutes now, each one a tsunami of sensation that required all her concentration to ride through. She had moved from sitting to walking to leaning against Cole for support, searching for any position that might ease the relentless pressure. "I need to push," she gasped suddenly, the urge coming upon her with startling urgency. "Cole, I need to push now." "Not yet," he said firmly, though his heart was racing. "Let me check first. We need to make sure you're ready." The examination confirmed what Lydia's body was telling. The baby was coming, and coming soon. Cole sent Ruth to fetch more hot water and clean towels while he helped Lydia back onto the bed, arranging pillows to support her in the most comfortable position possible. "Rory," he called to his son, "I need you to stay downstairs and keep the fires going. This might take a while, and we need to keep the house warm." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding that he was being given an important responsibility, even as he was being protected from sights that might be too intense for someone his age. As another contraction built, Lydia felt the overwhelming urge to push return, stronger than anything she had ever experienced. Her body seemed to have its own agenda now, following ancient instincts that required no conscious thought or direction. "All right," Cole said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "With the next contraction, you can push. Ruth, are you ready?" Ruth nodded, her young face set with determination. She had positioned herself at Lydia's side with a stack of clean towels and a basin of warm water, ready to assist in bringing her future brother into the world. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the warm circle of lamplight, 3 people who had chosen to become a family prepared to welcome its newest member. Whatever happened in the next hours, they would face it together, bound by love and determination that was stronger than any storm. The newborn's first blanket lay ready beside the bed, its soft wool knitted by Lydia's patient hands during the long evenings of autumn when she had dreamed of this moment. Hand-stitched with tiny roses around the border and lined with the finest cotton she could afford, it represented more than mere covering. It was love made tangible, hope transformed into something that could wrap around a child and keep him safe. At 12:47 in the morning on December 22nd, Samuel Hartwell Mercer drew his first breath and announced his arrival to the world with a cry that was both indignant and triumphant. The sound filled the bedroom like music, drowning out the wind that still howled outside and bringing instant tears to every eye in the room. "He's perfect," Cole breathed, his voice thick with wonder as he carefully cleaned the baby and wrapped him in the waiting blanket. "Lydia, he's absolutely perfect." Ruth stood beside the bed with tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed to her mouth in amazement. She had helped with the entire birth, following Cole's quiet instructions with the competence of someone far beyond her years, but nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming emotion of seeing new life emerge into the world. "Can I hold him?" she whispered, her voice full of reverence. Cole placed the baby gently in Ruth's arms, showing her how to support his head and cradle his tiny body. The sight of the 9-year-old girl holding her new brother with such tender care brought fresh tears to Lydia's eyes. This was what family looked like, not just shared blood, but shared love, shared responsibility, shared joy. "Hello, baby Samuel," Ruth murmured, studying the infant's crumpled features with fascination. "I'm your big sister Ruth. We've been waiting for you for such a long time." Lydia reached up to touch her son's tiny hand, marveling at the miniature perfection of his fingers and the surprising strength of his grip when he instinctively grasped her finger. He was smaller than she had expected, but clearly healthy, with a shock of dark hair and the unmistakable features of a Hartwell: the strong chin, the wide-set eyes, the stubborn line of his mouth, even in sleep. "Samuel," she whispered, testing the name they had chosen. "Our Christmas miracle." Cole finished the medical necessities with the calm efficiency that had seen them through the entire ordeal, then helped Lydia settle comfortably with the baby at her breast. The natural instincts of motherhood seemed to take over immediately, and little Samuel latched on with the determined vigor that suggested he would thrive. "He knows exactly what to do," Lydia marveled, watching her son's contented expression as he nursed. "Smart boy," Cole said, leaning down to kiss Lydia's forehead gently. "Takes after his mother." The storm outside was finally beginning to subside, the wind dropping from a howl to a moan, and the snow falling more gently past the windows. Dawn was still hours away, but the worst of the weather had passed, leaving them safe and warm in their cocoon of new family happiness. Rory appeared in the doorway, having been summoned by Ruth's excited calls. His eyes went wide when he saw the tiny bundle in his sister's arms, and he approached with the hushed reverence that children reserve for truly momentous occasions. "Is that really our brother?" he asked in wonder. "That's really him," Cole confirmed, lifting Rory up so he could get a better look at the baby. "What do you think?" "He's so little," Rory observed, reaching out to touch one tiny foot that had escaped from the blanket. "Was I ever that little?" "Smaller," Ruth informed him with all the authority of someone who had just participated in a birth. "Babies are always smaller than you remember." As the immediate excitement of the birth began to settle into quiet contentment, the family arranged themselves around the bed, in a configuration that felt as natural as breathing. Cole sat beside Lydia, one arm around her shoulders while she held the baby. Ruth curled up at the foot of the bed, unwilling to be far from her new brother. Rory climbed onto Cole's lap, where he could observe everything while still being part of the warm circle of family. "Tell me again about the night we were born," Ruth requested, her voice drowsy with exhaustion and emotion. Cole began the familiar story, but this time it felt different, not just a memory to be shared, but a foundation for the stories that would grow around this night. The night when Samuel arrived during the worst storm of the winter, the night when Cole delivered his future stepson with his own hands. The night when Ruth proved herself to be the most capable 9-year-old assistant any midwife could want. And Rory kept the fires burning all night long, Cole added, making sure his son understood his crucial role in the evening's events. Without him, we might all have frozen. The baby stirred in Lydia's arms, making the soft sounds that newborns use to communicate their needs and comfort. In the warm lamplight, his features seemed to shift and change, sometimes looking exactly like Samuel, sometimes showing hints of characteristics that might develop into something entirely his own. "He's going to be handsome," Ruth pronounced with the confidence of someone who had appointed herself the baby's primary guardian. "And smart, I can tell already." "How can you tell?" Rory asked skeptically. "The way he looks around. See how alert his eyes are? That means he's paying attention to everything." Lydia found herself smiling at the children's earnest discussion of their brother's future. This was exactly what she had dreamed of during those long months of pregnancy, not just a baby, but a family to welcome him. People who would love him unconditionally, who would help raise him and protect him and teach him about the world. "We should write down what happened tonight," she said suddenly, "so we can tell him the story when he's older." "I'll write it," Ruth volunteered immediately. "I'll write down everything, from when the contractions started until right now." As the night wore on and the baby settled into his first sleep outside the womb, the exhaustion of the day finally began to catch up with all of them. Cole arranged for Ruth and Rory to sleep in the spare bedroom down the hall, close enough to help if needed but far enough away to get proper rest. Alone with Cole and the baby, Lydia felt a profound sense of completion wash over her. The child she had carried for 9 months was finally here, healthy and perfect. The man she loved was beside her, having proven beyond any doubt his commitment to her and her son. The future that had seemed so uncertain just hours before now stretched ahead of them, full of promise and possibility. "Cole," she said softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping baby, but needing to say the words that filled her heart. "Thank you for everything, for being here, for helping me, for loving us." "Thank you," he replied, his voice equally soft, "for letting me be part of this, for trusting me with something so precious." Outside, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to show behind the clouds, bringing the promise of a new day and a new beginning. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in pristine snow that would reflect the morning sun like diamonds scattered across the valley. In the warm bedroom where Samuel Hartwell Mercer slept peacefully in his mother's arms, surrounded by the love of his chosen family, the future seemed as bright and clean as fresh snow, full of infinite possibilities and unconditional love. The new family portrait sat on the mantelpiece above the kitchen fireplace, a testament to how completely their lives had transformed in the span of a single year. Taken by the traveling photographer who had passed through Fort Harmony in late spring, it showed Cole and Lydia standing behind their 3 children, Ruth and Rory, flanking baby Samuel, who sat propped between them with the solemn expression that 6-month-old babies wear when trying to make sense of the world. Lydia paused in her morning baking to study the photograph, marveling at how natural they all looked together. There was no hint in their poses or expressions that this family had been assembled from the broken pieces of 2 different lives, no suggestion that love could be anything other than the seamless bond that connected them all. "Mama Lydia, the biscuits are ready," Ruth called from the stove, using the oven paddle with the competence of someone who had become an accomplished cook under Lydia's patient tutelage. At 10 now, Ruth had grown taller and more confident, but she still carried herself with the careful responsibility that had first impressed Lydia. She had appointed herself Samuel's primary caretaker after Lydia and Cole, reading to him every evening and insisting on helping with his baths and feedings. "Thank you, sweetheart. They smell wonderful." The kitchen that had once echoed with silence now hummed with the constant activity of a large family. Samuel sat in the high chair Cole had crafted for him, banging a wooden spoon against his tray and gurgling with pleasure at the noise he could make. Rory was at the table working on his arithmetic, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he wrestled with multiplication tables. Cole appeared in the doorway, brushing sawdust from his shirt and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had completed a good morning's work. The addition to the house was nearly finished, 2 new bedrooms and a proper parlor that would give them space to grow and entertain visitors properly. "The Peterson family will be here around noon," he announced, settling into his chair and accepting the coffee Lydia poured for him. "They want to see the breeding stock before making their final decision." The ranch had not only survived the financial crisis, but had begun to thrive under Cole's management and the partnership arrangement he had negotiated with the Chicago investors. The debt to Samuel's creditors had been paid in full, and the operation was expanding exactly as Samuel had originally envisioned. More importantly, Cole had proven himself to be a natural rancher with an instinct for both livestock and business that impressed even skeptical neighbors like Ezra Whitman. The man who had once sneered at Cole's presence now sought his advice on cattle breeding and pasture management. "Ruth, would you take Samuel out to the garden after breakfast?" Lydia requested. "I want to get the parlor ready for company, and he loves watching you pick vegetables." The garden had flourished under Ruth's dedicated care, producing vegetables that were the envy of every neighbor. She had a natural gift for growing things, and Lydia had been teaching her the art of preserving and canning that would serve her well throughout her life. As the family finished breakfast and dispersed to their various tasks, Lydia found herself reflecting on the miracle of how completely their separate lives had merged into something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have created alone. The marriage ceremony on Christmas Eve had been simple but profound, conducted in the warm kitchen of their home, with Reverend Henderson officiating and the twins serving as witnesses. Doc Morrison had arrived just as the service concluded, having finally made it through the snow to check on mother and baby, and he had stayed to share their wedding feast and toast their happiness. The community's acceptance had come gradually but genuinely. Cole's competence and integrity had won over the skeptics, while Lydia's obvious happiness had satisfied those who had worried about her welfare. The children's integration into the local school had proceeded smoothly, with Ruth quickly establishing herself as one of the brightest students and Rory winning friends with his infectious enthusiasm for everything from baseball to spelling bees. Samuel, now 6 months old and thriving, had become the darling of the entire valley. His cheerful disposition and obvious health had laid to rest any whispered concerns about the circumstances of his birth, and his resemblance to his father grew stronger with each passing month. But it was the smaller, daily moments that truly revealed the depth of their transformation. Cole's gentle correction of Rory's table manners delivered with the patient authority of a true father. Ruth's spontaneous hugs for Lydia, given with the unself-conscious affection of a daughter. The way Samuel's face lit up when any of his family members entered the room, recognizing love in all its forms. In the afternoon, as the Peterson family concluded their business and drove away with promises to finalize their purchase of breeding cattle within the week, Cole found Lydia in the nursery, folding clean clothes while Samuel napped in his crib. "Successful meeting?" she asked quietly, not wanting to wake the baby. "Very successful. That's the last of the debt payments, and we'll have enough left over to expand the herd next spring." Cole moved to stand beside the crib, watching his stepson sleep with the expression of complete contentment that had become his default whenever he looked at any of his children. "He's growing so fast," Lydia observed, joining Cole beside the crib. "Soon he'll be walking and getting into everything. Ruth and Rory will love that. They're already planning all the things they want to teach him." The baby stirred slightly in his sleep, his tiny fist curling around the edge of his blanket, the same blanket Lydia had knitted during those uncertain autumn months when the future had seemed so precarious. "Cole," Lydia said softly, taking his hand in hers, "do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't answered my advertisement?" "Every day," he replied honestly, "and every day I'm grateful that we found each other when we did." That evening, as had become their custom, the family gathered in the parlor after supper. Cole read aloud from the agricultural journals that helped him stay current with ranching innovations, while Lydia worked on sewing and the children pursued their own quiet activities. Samuel lay on a blanket on the floor, reaching for toys and practicing the rolling motion that would eventually lead to crawling. The scene was utterly ordinary and completely perfect, a family at peace with itself and confident in its future. The half-finished house had become a completed home, and the strangers who had found each other in desperation had become the foundation of each other's happiness. As the evening drew to a close and they prepared for bed, Lydia took one last look at the family portrait on the mantelpiece. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but whatever came, they would face it together. They had learned that family was not just about blood or law, but about the daily choice to love and support each other through whatever life might bring. In the bedroom she shared with Cole, Lydia removed Samuel's christening ring from her jewelry box, not to wear, but to remember. The gold band caught the lamplight, as it had done so many nights before, but now it seemed to bless rather than reproach, to celebrate the love that had been and the love that was yet to come. Outside, the Montana stars shone down on the valley where four lost souls had found each other and created something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows. Inside the warm house where love had taken root and flourished, the future stretched ahead like an unwritten story, full of promise and infinite with possibility.